Hey everyone, Molton here and welcome back to my review of Game 4 and 5 from the World Championship match. So both games ended up in a relatively harmless draw for both sides. The first one was actually played on Magnus's birthday with the white pieces, and Magnus here wasn't looking to be too ambitious on this particular day. He played a fairly solid line with the white pieces, not looking to put too much trouble against the Petroff, which is a very solid defense here from black. Knight takes e4, d4, d5, bishop d3, bishop d6. So we get into one of the main lines of the Petroff, which has been played numerous times. Castles, pawn goes to c4. So white's looking to put pressure here on this knight on e4, pawn to c6, rook to e1, bishop goes to f5, and I'm familiar with this line, having played it myself as well, and I know that there are two main moves here, queen b3 and queen c2. Queen c2 is the one I'm slightly more familiar with, and it leads to somewhat tricky positions after queen c2, knight a6, a3. But queen b3 is also a very popular option here, and it can get quite forcing. In this position, black has two main options. One was actually played by another fellow Australian in a very important match at the World Cup, I believe in the rapid section, where Anton Smirnov played this as black against Sergei Karyakin, and that game continued. Pawn takes on d5, pawn takes, and of course you can't take the pawn because bishop takes h2 would pick up the queen, so knight c3 instead. Knight goes to b4, and here black is sacrificing a pawn in order to get some compensation with the bishop pair, and also some blockade on d5. At some point, if white ever takes the bishop on d6 with the knight, then we reach some sort of opposite color bishop position where black has decent chances to hold. And after rook c8, the game continued. Bishop g5, queen d7, rook e2, and Sergei went on to win the game, but objectively speaking, the engine reckons that it's roundabout balanced with accurate play. But of course a pawn is a pawn, and white is still material up here. Instead, the game continued. Queen d7. After queen d7, the white played knight c3, but after knight takes c3, bishop takes f5, queen takes f5, the game continued. Pawn takes on c3, but white also has his option of queen takes b7, after which queen d7 can be played, and here you can't actually take the rook because the queen will often get trapped. I believe queen takes rook is met by knight a4, followed by knight b6 or knight a6, and this will pick up the queen for the rook on f8, with probably a favorable position for black. Instead, after queen takes d7, knight takes d7, pawn goes to c5. This has been played a number of times, including Caruana playing this against Wang Hao as white. The game continued. Knight e4, bishop f4, trying to prevent the rooks from going to the b8 square. Rook e8, f3, knight f6, knight f1. Most games at a high level play have ended in a draw in this position, but it seems like there's definitely some play here for both sides. Instead, after the move, queen takes f5, pawn takes on c3, play becomes quite forcing. Pawn goes to b6, and here white played the move pawn takes d5. Another move has been played in this position by Knightage, and this is perhaps maybe a more ambitious try for white to play bishop g5. The game continued. f6, bishop h4, pawn takes, queen d5, queen b3. As often is the case in these type of pawn structures, we see that white has this potentially passed pawn on the d file, and this is the main winning try for white, so he's going to want to keep options open when it comes to pushing this pawn later on. That's why we see knight a6, c4, queen f7, queen a4. The game continued. Bishop g3, takes, and white's looking to play rook d1 and push this pawn up the board. And white indeed went on to win a nice game. But instead we have the move pawn takes on d5, pawn takes, queen goes to b5, looking for some sort of c4 push here. Queen goes to d7, again very accurate move, sliding the queen back, forcing a trade of pieces, but again this has all been played before numerous times. Takes, and a5, and in this position pawn takes a6 has been played, knight takes, and all games have led to equality. Instead, knight h4 was preferred by Magnus, and after the move pawn to g6, white played the move g4. Relatively different idea from what has been seen before. White's looking to perhaps stop some sort of f5 ideas, give the king luft, and also look to retreat this knight to g2 where it can trade for this bishop on d6. Is often a very common idea in the Petroff to trade off these bishops. Knight d7, knight goes to g2, we have rook to c8, bishop f4, some trades happen, knight takes d5. So white does manage to get this past d pawn, but it wasn't quite enough in the game because without the rook being behind the pawn it's very difficult to push. Also black has this dangerous a pawn if we're not careful. So the game ended in a few checks here. White pushed, but sooner or later Magnus decided to just take the draw here. g5 securing the knight, and after pawn push, check again. White decided not to risk any further because this a pawn is getting very, very dangerous. So he took the perpetual here. And the game ended in a draw. Okay, so for the next game, we actually have a repeat of one of the previous games. In the Royal Lopez, again we had an anti-marshal with the move pawn to a4 here. This time instead there wasn't bishop b7 played. Magnus went for the move rook b8, which he's played before. Pawn takes, and anti-Sicilian move again, anti-marshal move, pawn to h3. The idea is that if white plays the move pawn to c3, Magnus is intending this pawn sacrifice, which he had against Duda. With the inclusion of this exchanges on the A and B file, it's unclear whether this favors black or white. So instead, after the move pawn to h3, we have pawn to d6, c3, b4, d3. So this seems a lot safer move than pawn to d4. Captures, and d5, which is a new move, if I recall. Trying to get some trades of pawns happening in the center, and something a lot more concrete than knight d7, which has been played before in this position. Knight bd2. We have some captures in the center. Bishop goes to d6, queen goes to c2. So the pawn structure is symmetrical, but white has slightly more active pieces here than black, and so maybe holds a very, very slight edge. The game continued pawn to h6. I believe Nepomniachtchi is still very well in preparation here as well, and white's moves are relatively simple to find. Knight e7, knight g3, knight g6, bishop to e3. Looking for some ideas of c4, c5 perhaps. Queen e8 was played, and I believe here is where Nepomniachtchi sort of let his advantage slip a bit by playing the move rook e to d1, which is a very natural move, but the move c4 might have posed a little bit more danger here for black. Immediately going for this bishop, trying to put it in a slightly more passive position. For example, if black goes for c5 trying to block it off, then there's a very nice maneuver here. We can play the move bishop to a4. Since bishop to d7 is not something black wants in these type of positions, we can just trade and then hop this knight into the f5 square, where it's very hard to get rid of later on. And if black instead moves the queen, then there can be ideas of bishop c6 and placing this bishop on the d5 square, where it's very hard to get rid of. If you ever exchange it off, then white has this dangerous passed pawn, and black will be left with this backwards pawn after we take back with the c pawn. So bishop e6 instead, maybe another idea, but then bishop a4 comes, and then c5 again, followed by rook d1. It doesn't look like much, but it's definitely much more pleasant for white, and the advantage I can feel creeping up and getting bigger and bigger as the game continues here, because it's just a lot more space for white. His bishops are a lot better, his pieces are a lot better, knight can perhaps hop into f5 one day. So definitely enough of an advantage to give decent winning chances here. Instead, after the move rook to d1, we had bishop to e6, and after bishop a4, bishop went back, knight d2, and then we had an exchange of bishops here. But I feel that after all these exchanges, black is more or less okay, and he's managed to stabilize the position. Rook to a8, we have more exchanges. It's just very hard to progress here as white, because black has no obvious weaknesses, everything's defended, and there's been a bit too many exchanges that have taken place. Knight c4, pawn to f3, so g4, so h4, h5, just trying to secure this knight on this square perhaps. Yeah, so white has a nice knight, but no weaknesses at all to attack. Everything is just defended. So the game ends in another relatively peaceful draw.